Thank you for having me. Of course, as we see, the conflict is expanding. It's not in Gaza anymore. It's reaching Syria, Iraq, even in the Red Sea, as we see more attacks from the Houthis on the naval route in the Red Sea. In Syria, in particular, the conflict, we see it more than anywhere else because Syria is still divided. The Assad regime is not in full control. There are no international relations between the Assad regime and the U.S. government or other international governments. This is why we see things in Syria are going out of control. There is a potential of big escalation in Syria because even when President Biden is going to decide to respond to the killing of 3 American servicemen, the response is potentially going to be in Syria because the consequences are not as much as if Biden do it inside Iran or even in Iraq. Unfortunately, for the American administration, maybe Syria is the least important place strategically in the Levant and in this region because the U.S. administration have more important priorities like Iraq, for example. The U.S. invested billions of dollars and, of course, also thousands of lives of the American troops in Iraq to make Iraq a productive partner and ally for the United States. So the priority is to keep Iraq, to keep the U.S. influence in Iraq. For Syria, the United States understand that the situation in Syria is very complicated. The Assad regime is fully dependent on Iran. So we know that since many years ago, the United States accepted the idea that Syria will be part of the Iranian axis or the sphere of influence for Iran. So Iran influence in Syria is growing and will always be there. And there is no big willing from the United States to contain it because containing the Iranian growth in Syria needs not only strikes from the US here and there in Syria on the Iranian militias, but also needs a coherent political strategy for Syria, which is not available yet. Yes, there are Arab ties with Damascus today. It's different than what things used to be 5 or 10 years ago when many of the Arab governments believed that there should be change in the regime in Syria. I don't think any of the Arab governments want a regime change in Syria now. This is why they restored diplomatic ties with Syria. But I see it all more symbolic than like something that will get tangible consequences or result or will fruit into more effective results for Syrian people. We see restoration for diplomatic relations, but we don't see, for example, financial aid coming from Arab countries to Syria, no plans to reconstruction efforts in Syria from the Arab sides. So I think the Arab countries, the Arab governments who restored relations with Syria, they don't want to be part of the regime change course or plan for Syria, but they also don't believe that an increasing effort and role for their countries in Syria is going to be any productive because what we just talked about, which is the growing Iranian influence in Syria, more than anywhere else, more than Iraq, more than Lebanon, because in Iraq and Lebanon, there are other groups and other parties who are challenging the US, the Iranian influence in these countries, while in Syria, the Assad regime is dominant, is stronger than any other group, and also the other group, like let's say SDF, who have their own troops, who have their own political influence, they are also today forced to speak to the Assad regime as they fear a US sudden withdrawal from Syria. Yes, let me start by answering the first part of your question. The situation in Syria is very chaotic. The war in Syria is far from over. We don't see Syria in the headlines, in the news anymore, but there is conflict on many levels and in many kinds in Syria taking place today. The U.S. is position and Biden administration position in precise is very complex when it comes to Syria and when it comes to the response to the killing of the U.S. troops in general, because on one hand he doesn't want the U.S. to look weak. He wants to respond to the killing of the U.S. Servicemen, but he doesn't want big escalation in the region, and he knows that Iran and Iran-backed militias are ready to escalate, are ready to kill more U.S. service members, to target U.S. partners and allies, like what happened in Erbil a few weeks ago. And on the other hand, also there are calls from the base of Biden administration, the progressives, the people who want to see less U.S. troops in the region. And this is not only the opinion among progressives and Democrats, but also among the far right, people who support Donald Trump. They don't want to see more of what they call endless wars, and what they see the situation and the U.S. mission in Syria. They look at it here in the United States, people from the far left and from the far right, as one of the endless war, and they see that there is no political solution that's taking place for Syria anyhow. So there are people who are pushing President Biden to withdraw. I don't think it's going to happen like this all of a sudden, because also Biden is very worried from the ramifications of a sudden withdrawal. We know that Turkey may start to attack northeast Syria if there is withdrawal. We know that Iran will expand its presence to northeast Syria. So I don't believe there is a sudden withdrawal before the elections. But if the Biden administration and the U.S. troops are going to be under bigger pressure from Iran-backed militias, and Biden will start to see more casualties from the U.S. troops, he may do it and withdraw from Syria, which is, of course, in my opinion, not the right thing to do, because ISIS activities are still seen in northeast Syria and on the borders between Syria and Iraq, and the consequences are going to be huge.